Welcome back to the California Conversation. I'm Tess Abraham. Last week, our beloved Governor Gavin Newsom sat down with right-wing political commentator Ben Shapiro for a 1 hour and 40-minute long interview on his podcast, This is Gavin Newsom. And that conversation was as intense, fast-paced, and interesting as you might expect. There could not be two people more diametrically opposed when it comes to their political viewpoints. But what might have surprised you if you watched it is that our dear governor didn't sound quite as radical as you might think that he is, which starts to pose the question, is Gavin Newsom really a secret moderate? Or is there far more to the story that we need to unpack? I am breaking out of our normal routine of the days that I post this podcast just to break it all down for you today. Okay, so I normally don't release podcast episodes on this day of the week, but I had to respond to the Gavin Newsom and Ben Shapiro interview. And when I heard that Ben Shapiro was going to be on Gavin Newsom's podcast, I about lost my mind because the thought of these two people sitting down and having a conversation about politics just sounded so interesting. And honestly, I just thought it's going to be a bloodbath. I'm sure that you know who Ben Shapiro is, but in case you don't, he is the CEO and main voice of The Daily Wire, which is a huge conservative media company. It's thought to be maybe the second largest after Fox in the United States. He has completely taken over for his ability to debate anyone on any topic, for his intelligence and quick wit, and he is most known for his famous saying of facts over feelings. Now, as you can imagine, that is very opposite to Governor Newsom, who is very liberal, and most liberals and Democrats like Gavin Newsom tend to despise Ben Shapiro and not want to engage with him. So it's incredibly interesting that the two of them were able to sit down to have this very long conversation on pretty much everything from personal lives to then obviously politics. But the thing that shocked me was that as I was listening to it, if I didn't know anything about Gavin Newsom, if I didn't know anything about California, I would tell you that Gavin Newsom was a moderate because he really didn't sound liberal. He didn't sound radical on any of the policy positions that he was talking about, and he tended to agree with Shapiro more than disagree. But the thing to remember here is that just because you're able to be polite or charismatic, as Gavin Newsom often can be with people he disagrees with, does not mean that you are being honest. And so just because he will sit down and ask you about the kids and about your upbringing and about your life doesn't mean that he is then going to turn around and be honest about every policy that you get into a discussion with him about. And that's really the number one takeaway from the entire interview that I walked away with, and I would hope that you walk away with if you watch it as well, is that Gavin Newsom is a charismatic person, but he is not honest. Quite frankly, he is a master at political manipulation and dishonest discourse. And when you look at the interview in whole and you listened to it a few different times, you start to see that there are several tactics that he uses whenever he sits down for an interview in order to deflect away from the topic at hand or to enhance his image when talking about something that usually wouldn't flatter California normally. And so before we get into the content of the interview, which we will get to because that's important, but before we get to the content, I think it's really important to frame the discussion because we can't honestly examine what's happening and what is being said if we don't also point out some of the tactics, honestly, some of the things that he uses when having this discussion, and also see some of the underlying motives at play. The first tactic that you'll see Gavin Newsom use is that he relies heavily on the past. So he really likes to blame shift onto past gubernatorial administrations in California. He likes to bring up the fact that policies have been in place for decades. He even brings up Ronald Reagan quite a few times, especially when it comes to things like CEQA or housing reform. He likes to say, I inherited a lot of these policies. We're talking about decades worth of policies that didn't happen overnight in California. And the reason that he brings those things up and that he brings up the past is to give the impression that this is not his fault. But if I could speak to that really quickly, we need to keep in mind that Gavin Newsom is the current sitting governor of the state. And as the current sitting governor, he is the person who has the most power to change the policy direction of our state. Yes, he has to work with the legislature. Yes, he works under the authority of the federal government. Yes, he does have cities and counties underneath his guidance, but the governor has great amounts of power, and a governor with a strong political plan in place can really affect change in the state that he manages. It's why we have a governor. And so it is false to just say, I rely on the past, or everything is the past's fault. He has had several years, several administrations to actually make change in the Golden State. Which leads to tactic number 2. Not only does he rely on the past, he also blames jurisdiction. And so what I mean about this is you'll also see him blame shift to local government. What he likes to say is, for instance, with sanctuary policy, that yes, California is a sanctuary state, but really we're hamstrung by what local governments, what cities and counties want to do. And so there are cities and counties that take our sanctuary policies to a further extent. And what is he really supposed to do about it? People have the right to vote for these city leaders that they want to see. And so they are represented in that way. And so ultimately, he doesn't just blame past administrations, he also blames current leaders who are under his jurisdiction, saying that local government are the ones who really enact most of the laws that we're seeing. What's interesting is that Governor Newsom doesn't seem to have a problem with suing local districts when it comes to things that he disagrees with. So, for example, we've talked in the past about how he has sued school districts on the basis that they would put into place a parental notification law that says that if a child is trying to gender transition, that they need to alert the parents immediately that that's happening. He has sued counties, he has sued school districts for trying to enact that. So it doesn't seem like he really has a problem exerting power over local government, but again, it's a tactic in conversation that he likes to use when he's backed into a corner about a certain issue that he knows that really does have something to do with his own policies, but it's really easy to blame shift onto jurisdiction issues. The third tactic is not only does he blame the past and not only does he blame jurisdiction, he also likes to deflect to other states or to the federal government. And you will hear this if you listen to the full interview on multiple topics. The main one he likes to bring it up on a lot is crime. If you talk about crime in California, he likes to immediately deflect to other states. And so in the interview, when crime is brought up, he immediately says, let's talk about Louisiana. Louisiana has a higher murder rate, and so why aren't we talking about them? To which Ben Shapiro replies, well, Governor, you are the sitting governor of California, so let's talk about California. You're the one who actually has power over this state. I don't want to talk about a different state. But he does this numerous times. He does it with tax rates. He does it on several occasions. And so what he likes to do is you bring up something difficult, and he says, look at 16 other states in the nation that have similar issues. Again, we're talking to you. You have jurisdiction over this state. So you need to provide an answer for why things are the way that they are in California. I'm not asking about Louisiana or Oregon or Illinois or any other state in the union. I'm asking about your state. And lastly, his fourth tactic, and this is the most confusing one of all, is that he will frame everything as if he agrees with you, even if he has enacted policies that have worsened the problem that you are bringing up. And this is something that Adam Carolla actually pointed out on Fox News after he watched this interview. He said that when you watch Gavin Newsom, he will take the issue that you are talking about into account, and he will immediately spin it back to say, you're absolutely correct. And so if you bring up something like housing and you say housing in California is super expensive, he will say, totally agree. I completely agree with you. It is too expensive. And I have been fighting. I have been working. I have been tireless in my pursuit of making that better, of getting prices down. And suddenly you as the viewer or you in the conversation start to get confused and start to be like, so you see that this is an issue. You're saying that you've been working on it. Maybe this is a lot harder or more complicated than I think. Maybe you're doing a lot more for it than I'm giving you credit for. And so suddenly we're on the same side. And so we position to be on the same side, which means now you speak very authoritatively and you say, well, I have passed bill after bill after bill. And that's something that you can't necessarily respond to in full if you don't know those bills off of the top of your head. And so it gets very confusing very quickly. But let's clear up the confusion. No, you do not agree with Gavin Newsom on the issues that you are bringing to him, or in this case, on the issues that Shapiro is bringing up in this interview. Gavin Newsom likes to disassociate himself. He likes to act like he is outside of these issues for the many different reasons I just said. He inherited them, they are a product of the local government, or they are just a national issue across other states or the federal government. So he likes to take himself out of the equation so that he cannot be blamed for why the situation is continuing the way that you're pointing out. But Gavin Newsom is not an outside figure. Like I said before, he is the person who sets the policy direction for the state of California. He signs and vetoes bills every single year that get to go into effect. He has great sway for who will be elected in California, and he is ultimately the voice and representative for the people in the state of California. He cannot set himself outside of the issues that California faces, no matter how much he tries to do that. And this is all because, point blank, Governor Newsom is a sociopath. He wants power. If he was trying to actually engage in honest conversation, he would have a shred of consistency. But the man is not consistent. If you look at what he has said in the past, if you look at what he said a week ago, and then you compare it to some of the things said in this interview, you see that he completely shifts his mentality. He tries to say whatever he thinks in the moment will whip himself votes without making his base too angry at him. And as soon as his base is outraged over something he said, he immediately will go out and walk it back and instead say more things that he thinks that they want to hear. He just wants to stay in power and to climb the ladder to the next position of power. Don't take my word for it. You should listen to it. We're going to look at some clips today, and you should judge for yourself what you think. But you should judge with honesty. You cannot just listen to what he says and think, that sounds pretty good. You need to do the hard work of looking at what he says and actually examining, is that true? And so I want to walk through a few of the major points. We don't have enough time to go through the whole thing. I really wish that we could, because I'd love to respond to every point he makes. But I want to walk through at least some of the major points that him and Ben discuss and that weren't able to be fully debunked through the course of the interview to help understand how we should be evaluating the things that Newsom is saying. And I think in doing that, we will come to see that he hasn't been quite as honest as he might claim that he has been. One of the first policy topics that was discussed was, of course, on the issue of immigration, and specifically on federal immigration enforcement, or ICE, in the state of California. And so Shapiro poses the question, from a pragmatic level, wouldn't it make more sense for California to cooperate with ICE by mandating that local law enforcement work with them in situations of arresting people in order to actually hand them over to ICE if they are not here legally, so that then ICE doesn't have to conduct raids, they don't have to show up in public spaces, because instead they could just show up at police stations or at jailhouses, and that's where they could pick up illegal immigrants directly. Let's listen to Gavin Newsom's response.
So instead of ICE going to, as you say, hospitals and churches to pick people up, they'd be going to jailhouses to pick people up.
That's exactly what they do in California, and we have over 10,000 that I've cooperated with since I've been governor of California. We work very directly with ICE as it relates to CDCR, our state prison. California has cooperated with more ICE transfers probably than any other state in the country. And I vetoed multiple pieces of legislation that have come from my legislature to stop the ability for the state of California to do that. So when it comes to the issues of violent criminals, when it comes to felons, people that are being released from the largest state system in the United States of America, California cooperates with ICE.
I have no words to that. California cooperates with ICE? Really, Governor Newsom? We're supposed to believe that? I don't have words, but I have formed more words. So let's break it down. He says that in his time as governor, he has cooperated with ICE in terms of state prison, and that he has facilitated 10,000 transfers, which he brags is more than any other state in the United States. Now, this is technically true, and so I will give him kudos that what he's saying is factually true. But there is a lot of missing context that actually changes the entire meaning of what he is talking about. So Let's start with cooperation with ICE. What he's saying is that they cooperate on a state prison level. And so if someone is convicted of a serious felony and then sent subsequently to state prison, that will go into the system that corresponds with ICE to let them know, hey, this person is in state prison. He's an illegal immigrant, has committed a felony, and this is the release date and time. And so then ICE can come to pick up that person at the state prison. Here's the problem. Cooperation with ICE at the state prison level is not nearly the same as cooperation with ICE at the local level. Cooperating with them at the level of state prisons is literally the bare minimum that you could do. We are usually talking about very serious criminals with felony offenses who have also been given long sentences in prison. And then beyond that, they've been sent not just from local jails or county jails, but to state prisons. And so now, after they serve that lengthy sentence, ICE is able to come and pick them up if they so choose. What Newsom fails to address is that California blocks local law enforcement from alerting or cooperating with ICE on, again, that local level. Local police cannot ask anyone that they arrest about their immigration status. They cannot hold inmates for ICE, and they cannot notify ICE of inmates' release dates and times in the same way that they can do with state prison. And so that means that often illegal immigrants who have committed multiple crimes that have not risen to the level of a state prison or a felony are then just released back into the community without the federal government having any knowledge about it at all. And so that is what forces ICE to come in and conduct raids within communities and in public spaces. And then to take it a step further, you have to further frame the context in California to understand that a lot of criminals don't make it to that state prison step in the first place. And that is because California, and especially in Los Angeles, it is increasingly a goal to redefine crime downward. And so we have seen over the past several decades that felonies are reduced to misdemeanors, repeat offenders are treated as nonviolent. We have pursued certain policies that allow for early release, that have diversion policies instead of sending them to prison, like community service, as well as zero bail policies. And prosecutors, in many cases, do not even pursue a lot of these cases because they know that when brought before a judge, that they will not actually end in jail time. And so if you are not even convicted of a felony or sent to state prison, then California doesn't cooperate with ICE because you never make it into the system that alerts federal law enforcement of your whereabouts and your immigration status. And we should be serious about this issue because Gavin Newsom himself has bragged about the fact that he has closed several state prisons across our state in his tenure as governor. And he has said that he continually wants to work to reduce the prison population. So if you are reducing the prison population by sending less people to prison, which is what is happening in California, then all of a sudden, none of those people will make it into the system to flag ICE to come pick them up. So that's not really cooperation. So I just want you to see that even in just this 30-second clip, there is massive amounts of context that is completely missing. There are facts and figures that our governor is distorting, and there are ideas that are being put out there of, oh, California cooperates with ICE. Done. That is just clearly not true. But here's the real kicker. You don't need any of that debunking to know that what Newsom is saying there is untrue. Anyone who hears that statement should instantly laugh because Governor Newsom has been one of the worst offenders when it comes to rhetoric around ICE. We talked a few weeks ago about the fact that he signed a bill in 2025 that prohibits ICE from being able to wear masks in order to protect their identities, even though violence against ICE agents has risen over 1,000% in the last year. We've also seen the mass rioting that has happened across Los Angeles. Just think back to last summer. And we saw mass riots where people were burning American flags. They were setting cars on fires. They were throwing bricks at local businesses. They were going crazy over the idea of federal immigration enforcement. And did Governor Newsom step in at any point? No, he fought President Trump when President Trump sent the National Guard to try to help and protect ICE officers. So I don't really believe that his actions are lining up with his words here. And then, of course, we also have to talk about the rhetoric that he has used when talking about ICE. And so just listen to this clip from the Stephen Colbert Show.
The ICE issue is alarming beyond words. It is the largest private domestic army of its type, police force, anywhere in the world. He'll have 30,000 people that increasingly appear to be swearing an oath of office to him, not the Constitution of the United States. Again, wake up to what's going on in this country. That's happening in the United States of America. Masked men jumping out of unmarked cars, people disappearing, no due process, no oversight, zero accountability, happening in the United States of America today. People ask, well, is authoritarianism, you're being hyperbolic? Bull, we're being hyperbolic.
Really, Governor? So you are going to sit there and you are going to say masked men, people disappearing, no due process. And then you're going to turn around and you're going to sit in front of Ben Shapiro and you're going to say California cooperates with ICE. So which is it? Which do you believe? Is ICE evil and authoritarian and worth being completely disregarded and worth being abolished in your state and cities? Or is ICE federal law enforcement and they have the right to carry out the federal law? And so you cooperate with them. Are they committing human rights violations, which is what he accuses them of? Or are they not? It should not be that hard for him to be consistent on, but there is absolutely no consistency with this topic. So there's a lot more that was said on immigration. There's a lot more that I want to dive in with immigration that I want to fully debunk. But this is only one topic and I have like several others, so I really need to keep it moving. So we're going to move on. But all of that to say, you can see from this one clip alone that the man is a liar. And you can see if you listen to the rest of his discussion on immigration that he does the blame shifting. He talks about, well, California sanctuary policies were enacted under Governor Jerry Brown back in, I believe, 2017 or 2018. And so that predates him. And then on top of that, local jurisdictions have their own sanctuary policies. And so he cannot force any local government to cooperate with ICE, even though he could as the governor. So he just blame shifts all the way around, accepts no responsibility for his own rhetoric and what he has said about ICE. And then he turns around and says, California cooperates with ICE. Let's just level set that. California cooperates with ICE. No, I'm sorry. They don't. You're lying. But for now, let's move to the housing crisis. And so I just want you to think in your mind for a second, what is housing like in California? Is housing affordable? Is there a large supply of housing that will drive down costs? Are there regulations in place that make housing development more difficult? These are all questions that you know the answers to experientially from living here, or you know by reputation about California. So I just want you to remember those things because we're going to listen to a clip now and Governor Newsom is about to get very confusing.
The housing crisis in California is particularly bad. I mean, there are places like Phoenix or Austin or there's
the original. I said yesterday or last week in the state of states, the original sin, our inability to get out our own way on all the regulatory thickets.
Right. So
we blew through those in the last couple of years. 61 housing reform bills we just passed, and Ezra was highlighting that. Interesting.
Yes.
New York just moved in a direction. I think finally we Democrats broadly are moving now finally in the right direction after decades and decades. Democrats and Republicans in California. You made my speech and my argument the last 3 years in terms of the housing reforms we pursued. Could not agree more. I highlighted the 61 bills just last year. I didn't highlight the 42 CEQA reform bills. The original, talk about process and regulatory thickets, those environmental rules that were established, ironically, by Ronald Reagan himself when he was governor of California. So we've been in the process of doing precisely what you're suggesting we need to do, and we've been doing it very meaningfully and been nation-leading reforms in this space. I agree with you broadly in all this. I mean, the fact is we've been tackling all. I can't make up for 50, 60 years. And you're talking about literally a 50-year trend line as it relates to the issues of cost of housing and affordability. But I can talk in terms of the substantive actions we've taken.
All right. So you can see from this clip that he invokes many of the tactics that I mentioned at the top of the show. He first frames the entire conversation as agreement. He says, absolutely, it is too expensive to live here. I have been trying to tackle this issue. I've been trying to make nation-leading reforms in this space because he is essentially trying to say, I agree with you, Ben Shapiro, that housing is too expensive here. And then he shifts to say, we've done all of these things. We have passed all of these bills. We've tried to cut down CEQA. We've tried to make reform so that it is easier to develop housing. And then he again invokes the name of Ronald Reagan and says that CEQA was in place under Reagan when he was governor. And so really that's a past administration. It's a California thing that he had inherited. And so you start to think, okay, he sees that this is an issue. And you start to get the impression, maybe this is a lot more difficult to solve than I would think that it is. And maybe he really agrees with us on these steps that need to be taken to reduce the cost of housing across California. But what's the truth behind these claims? First, let's just level set. Gavin Newsom has been the governor since 2019. He has had supermajorities in the legislature. He has passed nearly every piece of housing legislation that has come across his desk. At some point, inherited problems become personal failures. And so we need to throw out this idea that Gavin Newsom has just inherited the housing crisis and it is the same across the nation. So it's something that he can't do anything about. That is not true. Second, California does not suffer from a lack of housing legislation. It suffers from actual, tangible results and outcomes that make it better. Gavin Newsom likes to say, well, I've made all of these reforms. I've signed all of these bills. He throws out numbers, 46 bills, whatever, that he has signed, all the ways he's rolled back CEQA. Why isn't it working? That's my question. That's the question that you should be asking of every single thing that he says. If you are doing all of this, why is it not better? Why is it getting progressively worse? Why have prices only continued to increase? If these reforms were actually effective, Californians would have felt it, but they have not felt it. And so, Governor, you have done all of these things. Why isn't it better? What Governor Newsom wants you to do here, and what he wants you to do on every topic, is to disbelieve your own eyes. He wants you to suspend reality and what you see around you, because every person living in California knows that housing is expensive. He can say everything that he wants about the reforms that he has passed. They have not worked. They have only failed Californians. You know that intuitively. And so do not let him tell you, don't believe what you're seeing around you. And this ties into later comments that he is going to make about the economy as a whole and the state of the economy and spending in California. And so Newsom doesn't want to talk about the fact that cost of living is very high in California. He wants to compare to other states. He wants to blame shift again onto the federal government. And he does not want to look realistically at the outcomes of the policies that were signed by him.
How about radically lowering the income tax rates in the state?
California has tax. I mean, there's 16 states right now. Let's talk about those 16 states.
Why don't we talk about California? That's
I'm going to. They tax their low-wage earners more than California taxes its high-wage earners. Let's talk about those, lowering those tax rates in those 16 states. We have the highest tax rate for the 1%. But the overall tax burden, and there's been independent analysis after independent analysis, is marginally higher than the national average.
Okay, so let's just start with taxes. That's where he starts. If you live in California, do you feel like your taxes are reasonable here? Do you feel like the tax burden actually isn't that bad compared to your friends who live in other states, or maybe if you have lived in another state? Because I am not wealthy by any means. I am not in the 1% that Gavin Newsom is talking about here. And yet my tax burden is ridiculous. So I don't really want to hear my governor sit there and say, well, the overall tax burden for the average Californian is only slightly higher than the average tax burden for anyone across the United States, as he sits there in his millions of dollars a mansion and eats at the French Laundry. Now, this is another spot where what Gavin Newsom says is technically true, but it's used to create a completely false impression because it is missing a lot of context and clarity. And so he says there are 16 states that tax their low-income workers more than their high-income workers, and that California, even though it has the highest tax rate on the top 1%, has an overall tax burden that's around the national average. That sounds reassuring, but it's actually deeply misleading. And that's because he talks about an average of tax burden, but he's collapsing all different types of taxes just into that one average. But when you live in California, taxes don't exist in a vacuum. And so they are put on top of the already overpriced prices that you are paying for everything else. And so if we have the highest housing costs, the highest gas prices, and some of the highest utility rates across America, as well as general inflation in terms of the grocery store and other goods that we are buying, then a dollar taxed in California hurts more because everything else already costs more. And so it's really a very tone-deaf approach to the burden that people are feeling because they already pay so much money to live here. And as usual, Gavin Newsom likes to point to the 1%, the top 1%, because he thinks that that gives him moral cover. He thinks he can say, look, I'm just taxing the rich and no one will really be mad about that because the rich have a lot of money. And so I'm working for you, middle class worker. However, once again, we are missing pieces here because if taxing the rich actually worked, shouldn't California's budget problems be solved? Why is it that we are in a budget deficit? But this is another topic that Gavin Newsom doesn't want to be honest about. And so that leads us to this beautiful line.
You don't give a damn about debt, but that's another conversation.
Oh, no, I definitely give a damn about debt, but I do not
Trump
think...
doesn't appear to, does he?
I don't think anyone seems to care very much about that, Governor.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair...
Well, we balance our budgets, just for the record.
I mean, kind of.
100%. I just submitted a balanced budget on a de minimis $2 billion, 2 point something odd billion dollar, which is a rounding error in the state. Balanced budget submitted.
We balance our budgets? $2 billion is a rounding error? What world do I live in? My gosh, this audacity, this absurdity might be one of his worst claims in the entire interview. Okay, I've composed myself. Let's tackle this claim that we balance our budgets here in California. Gavin wants to talk accounting. Let's talk accounting. Here's the bottom line. We don't. We don't balance our budgets here in California. California can adjust the revenue based on economic factors. And so if they have a very favorable economic outlook, that means it will increase their revenues because it should be increasing the amount that we are receiving from the personal income tax as well as the corporate tax. But personal income taxes and corporate taxes are dependent on the state of the economy insofar as they depend on people having stable jobs, making high incomes, and corporations earning revenues that they can then be taxed upon. And so when you look at the Legislative Analyst's Office here in California, you see that they are actually warning that the stock market could easily reverse course. That could cause revenues to drop sharply, and that will then expose deficits. And so if you have a more conservative and more realistic view of the budget, you will see that what Governor Newsom is saying here is absurd because it is not true. And so that's why we actually have LAO projections of what the budget will result in that is often wildly different than the budget that Governor Newsom puts forward, the budget that he claims is balanced. Let's look at the numbers because this is the fourth year in a row that we are going to end in a deficit, and the LAO is projecting a deficit even into 2027 and 2028. So the 2022 to 2023 projected budget deficit by the LAO was $32 billion. Congrats, Gavin Newsom. But it gets worse because the following year it was projected to be a $46 billion deficit. The next year after that was projected $12 billion. And then 2025 to 2026 was projecting a $17 billion budget deficit. Now, Gavin Newsom has been able to do gymnastics with the numbers to get that down to $2 billion. That's what he's referencing there when he says $2 billion. That's a rounding error. That shows you how out of touch he is because $2 billion doesn't sound like a rounding error to me. But on top of that, the LAO is warning that the deficit gap could continue to widen over the next 2 years so that by 2027 to 2028, the deficit could reach up to $35 billion. So does it sound like California balances its budget? Or does it sound like Governor Newsom just messes with the numbers so that he can put forward his budget when it is due? And then in retrospect, we can look back and actually see that we spent far more than what we brought in. And just in case he wants to deflect to our lovely president, I want to remind you that the deficit has been in place for the past 4 years. Donald Trump has only been president for 1 year. So this precedes Donald Trump. You cannot blame the federal government for your deficit problems here in California. You cannot blame them for your economic problems because that was under Joe Biden, your fellow Democrat. All right, and last but certainly not least, and probably what was his worst and most pathetic moment, and trust me, I don't say that lightly because there was a lot in this interview that was bad. There's a lot more that I can't even go into because I just don't have the time, and the budget comment was pretty bad. But all of that to say, and what was probably his worst moment was when Governor Newsom was pressed on his beliefs about transgender ideology.
The fundamental question that lies at the root of all of this is the question that you're not wanting to answer, which is whether boys can become girls.
Yeah, I think for the grace of God. Yeah, for time immemorial. God bless.
So Gavin Newsom goes on to make 2 points on this topic. He says, first, why do you care about this issue so much? And 2, I see the human element in these policies. And so I have compassion toward people who are claiming to be transgender. And that is what drives the policies that I enact here in California. I want to respond to both of those, obviously. First, why do we care? This is an issue that is fundamentally based on principles of truth. It is based on objectivity and what is saying is right and wrong. We base our government policies because we base all of our lives based off of what we believe is true. There has to be some sort of foundation by which you pass laws because laws designate things that are right and they are wrong. They work to protect people against injustice. Injustice would be to say that something is wrong. You can only say that something is wrong by some sort of clear standard. And so that standard has to be brought back to what is actually true. That inevitably is going to have an impact on the policies that you pass. And when we look at this as it regards minor children, we see that this opens children up to that delusion that says how I feel trumps any other sort of objective truth or reality about my situation. And when how you feel rules what you do, then in the state of California, you are allowed to make irreversible decisions that impact your health, your well-being, and your physical body. So yes, Governor Newsom, it matters. It matters because truth matters. It matters because we must have some agreement in society about foundational objective truths that we then base our policies off of. And it matters because it does have real world impacts on little boys and girls who make decisions that they do not understand the ramifications of fully when they are just 14 years old. Which then leads very naturally into answering his second point, which is all about compassion and empathy. You can absolutely feel compassion for somebody who is struggling with an issue. You can feel compassion for a person who is struggling with gender dysphoria or extreme discomfort and unhappiness and suicidal thoughts when it comes to their gender or when it comes to their identity. But what Gavin Newsom and Democrats broadly have done on this issue is they have only felt compassion and empathy for one side, and they have not felt compassion for people who are affected on the other side. Where is Gavin Newsom's empathy, or where is his compassion for parents who have literally lost their children due to gender ideology and due to the laws in California that did not protect their parental rights to raise their children in accordance with their values? Where is your compassion for the children who later in life come out, these detransitioners who come out and say that these horrors were done to me, that I am missing parts of my body, that I am permanently infertile, that I deal with these horrific side effects for the rest of my life because I did not know what I was getting into when I was just 14 years old? Where is your compassion for them? Public policy is not based off of compassion or empathy. Compassion and empathy can sway you either which way when it is not grounded and rooted in truth. Public policy has to be based off of truth because it must be based off of what is objectively good for the flourishing of society and for the greater population as a whole. So no, Gavin Newsom, you are not more compassionate than the rest of us. You have just directed all of your compassion in one direction and completely ignored everyone else. If Gavin Newsom is such a compassionate, empathetic guy, why doesn't he care at all about the babies who are literally ripped apart inside of their mother's wombs and are killed in the place where they should be protected most? And that leads us into the main and final point of all of this. Gavin Newsom is a pathological liar. He has no backbone. He has no beliefs. He will say whatever he thinks will blow him into further power, whichever way the wind blows. You cannot have an honest, good faith discussion with somebody who will just lie his entire way through it. And that is exactly what Gavin Newsom did here. So if you listened to that interview or you plan to listen to it and you walk away thinking, is Gavin Newsom a moderate? No, he's greedy for power and he's desperate to achieve it any which way. And right now, his eyes are set on the presidency and he will do anything and he will say anything to achieve that goal. But the most dangerous part of all of this is that it works. It works if people choose to suspend reality. It works if people refuse to believe their own eyes, if they ignore outcomes, if they refuse to hold their leaders accountable to the things that they're saying and demand consistency. Because once we allow our leaders to lie like this and continue to be rewarded for it, then the failure that their terrible policies that has enacted becomes permanent. We have seen this happen for decades here in California, but we cannot and we should not by any means let that happen to our country.